Good evening to everyone. Please bear with me a few minutes as we are waiting for our speaker to join us. Dr. Bahout is on his way to join us on the Zoom. In the meantime, let me say a few words of introduction. My name is Jean-Luc Saman, and I will be your host for the next hour. We will be discussing the issue of Lebanon, with a big question mark being, is Lebanon on the brink of a new civil war? Just a few words on the origin of this talk. As most of you probably saw in the news about a year ago, Lebanon shocked the public opinion worldwide with the explosion of the port in Beirut in the summer of 2020. But the explosion in the port of Beirut was not really the starting point of the crisis in the country. It could be seen rather as the culminating point, the catalyst for everything that was going wrong, in a sense, inside the country. So what we're going to try to do for the next hour is to unpack the different dimensions of this crisis in Lebanon. In a sense, the crisis in Lebanon is a cocktail, if I can use that expression, between domestic, economic, regional issues. Just a few words, for instance, on the economic and financial dimension of the crisis that we will be exploring in a few minutes. The GDP of Lebanon in 2018 was considered to represent about $55 billion. This year, it is estimated to represent $20 billion. So you can have here a scale of the economic crisis. The GDP per capita fell by about 37%. And what it means is that today we consider that about 78% of the Lebanese population is below the poverty line. In addition to this economic crisis, or maybe to explain this economic crisis, you have the inability, the enduring inability of repeated governments in Beirut to find a solution and to implement the reforms which have been demanded by the international community, and in particular by the International Monetary Fund. In addition to that, also, you have something which is maybe at the core of the Lebanese crisis, which is the exacerbation of sectarian rivalries, the way communities are more and more using the crisis, the ongoing crisis, to reunite their own agendas. And we see here some elements, some relic of the Lebanese civil war that lasted between 1975 and 1989. In addition to that, finally, one thing which we will be exploring as well is how Lebanon is still, in a sense, the battleground of power plays in the Middle East. We see that very regularly through the conflicts between Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah, one of the political parties, as well as a military organizations in Lebanon. We see also the influence of Iran, which is one of the main sponsors of Hezbollah inside Lebanon. And we also see the competition between Gulf states inside Lebanon, recently with the dispute between the Lebanese government and Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, recalling its ambassador following negative statements by one of the Lebanese ministers on the war in Yemen. So this, as I said, is a cocktail of many different issues that altogether create the Lebanese crisis. As I said, we will try as much as possible to unpack all these dimensions for the next hour. And to do that, the Middle East Institute invited one of the prominent experts on Lebanon. We will be discussing all these different elements with Dr. Joseph Bahout, who is joining us from Beirut, where he's the director of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. Let me add that Dr. Bahout has extensive experience, not only just in Lebanon, but has been working for the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs in France, as well as a senior research fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Let me check if Dr. Bahout has been able to join us. I think we are still having an issue with his access to the Zoom link. Maybe in this case I'll have the challenge of entertaining this webinar in the meantime. Let me just add one element that might be also relevant for us in the discussion, which is the role of the international community. As I said, Lebanon can be seen as the battleground for regional competition between Middle East powers such as Iran, such as Israel, or the Gulf states. But as we've seen, especially over the last year since the crisis started with the explosion of the port in Beirut, we've seen also greater interests of external powers. France has been at the front line of the international efforts to solve the Lebanese crisis. President Macron made it a personal mission last year, visiting the country twice following the explosion of the port of Beirut. And then we have seen also the role of the International Monetary Fund, which is a crucial actor with regards to the economic and financial dimensions of the crisis. Having said that, this is again impossible in a sense to solve the crisis only from the outside, meaning that what we've seen over the last year with the efforts of the international community is that this crisis can only be eventually solved from the inside, meaning that it has to be solved by the domestic actors, that the government in Beirut, as well as the different communities have to respond to this crisis. Let me add a few words on the organization of our webinar as Dr. Bahout is joining us. As it has been the case in previous events of the Middle East Institute, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I will then try to ask them as many as possible. The way we will conduct this talk is by asking our speaker, who is literally joining us right now. I believe there were some issues with the internet in Lebanon. So I think you have here a concrete example of the many challenges in the country. Introduction to the current situation in Lebanon. But the first question, just to give a feeling for the people in Singapore about how is it today for the people in Lebanon. I just mentioned the fact that about 78% of the population is now living under the poverty line. Can you just tell us very briefly, maybe concretely, what is it to live under this current financial crisis?
Mm-hmm. Look, first of all, thank you, Jean-Louis, and Jean-Louis, thank you for the Middle East Institute. And I'm really extremely sorry for the delay, but and this is partly a way to answer you. I mean, I arrived to my office something like half an hour ago, and I was very quickly confronted with slow internet. We are now on generators, so the computer has some problems, and etc. So this is the way, in fact, the normal average Lebanese are struggling with the day-to-day life. To give you a broader answer, let me take issues one by one. First of all, it's been now 2 years that the banking sector in the country is completely almost in shambles. It has collapsed in the most extreme sense of the word. So the type of crisis that you could have seen in Greece or elsewhere is mild compared to Lebanon. This means that, for example, even if you are averagely wealthy in Lebanon, you cannot access physically your money, you cannot access your deposits. There is a kind of informal capital control, although the government has not announced one. So you cannot really, in fact, use your money, transfer it, withdraw it. Your credit cards are completely today useless. You have a ceiling for withdrawals, and this ceiling is barely enough for a normal family to live. So you have to have cash on the side. This is one side of the problem that is becoming really very tough for everyone. The second problem that is more, let's say, graver is that the national currency has lost more than 9/10 of its value, meaning that the salaries have completely melted. And we'll talk about it maybe later on. This has maybe potentially very important and dramatic effects when you know, for example, that the salary of the wage of a soldier today in Lebanon is something like $25, meaning that this person is barely eating. He will probably be demoralized if things go on like that. We don't know if they will still obey their command. This is part of the problem. Salaries are on the ground, really have melted. People cannot make a subsistence. It's been now 6-7 months. We have drastic electricity cuts. So it means that the average Lebanese households are living with 6 to 7 hours electricity per day, private generators included, because the price of fuel has also rocketed, and the generators are unable to provide themselves with fuel. We had a gas station crisis, so we had to stay home for 2-3 months because you couldn't even drive your car. The medics are starting to also lack. We have a shortage of medics. People who are abroad are coming back to Lebanon, or people who have family abroad are sending medics to Lebanon with full luggages. So really we are in a country, and this is maybe the most important point, in a country where usually material quality of life was not a problem. Lebanon has always had political problems, security problems, but it was an affluent country. For the first time in its history, the country is really becoming a country that could be ranked in the category of countries that need international help. I was talking with the UN representative last time, and she was telling me that for the first time in history, Lebanon is now ranked in the 10 countries that need help from the World Food Program, which is completely unused in Lebanon. So these are the conditions. Now, of course, we will need to talk about more macro issues. What does it mean in terms of macroeconomy and in terms of political development? But this is only to give you an idea of the day-to-day situation.
But if we go back to maybe to the origins, I mean, if you had to pick one or two of the main reasons for why Lebanon is in that situation now, well, how would you explain? Because as you said, I mean, Lebanon used to is not used to this kind of situation. So how would you explain the turn of events? What are the main reasons?
In fact, unfortunately, it has been a long time coming, this crisis. I mean, people who are surprised today are either, are in myopia or in fact are in denial, because it has been a while that this crisis has been building up. I would maybe single out two reasons to answer your question, or two causes. The first one is the accumulation of political economy choices that were made by the Lebanese elite since the end of the war. So this crisis is not new. The Ponzi scheme, as we call it, has been building up for more than 2 decades now, or 1 decade and a half. It was a kind of indirect rentier economy, living on remittances from Lebanese expats, living on the idea that Lebanon could not be a productive country. So the banking sector was hypertrophic. Living on the idea that you can only live out of the largesses of the Gulf states and regional countries and etc. And you can live by allowing the Lebanese society to really live above its means by serving very high interest rates and other, let's say, returns, by simply doing some financial engineering, etc., etc. All this bubble, in fact, has exploded 2 years ago, and many were seeing this coming. So this is the end of a very artificial financial model that allowed the political class, in fact, to roll the ball and to kick the can down the road, the can of reforms, the can of seriously building a viable economy, and seriously putting the country on the track of being more productive and more serious. The second cause, probably that compounded all this and led to the explosion, is the geopolitical situation and the political situation, namely the loss of confidence by the Lebanese in their system with time, and the complete loss of confidence of the regional stakeholders in Lebanon, because of many issues, mainly geopolitical. And we have to admit that probably the choices that were made by the potent forces in Lebanon, like Hezbollah and others, meaning entering the war in Yemen, being part of the war in Syria, having a share in the crisis in Iraq, led to the punishment of Lebanon by several countries that, in fact, made a kind of financial siege against the financial system. This has led to the rarefaction of remittances, of the flow of money, and it has led also to the exacerbation of this crisis. But for the first time, I think, in its history, the nature of the crisis in Lebanon today is really structural. It is no more something that you can deal with certain engineerings. You have now to address the root cause of the problem of this country, meaning its political construct, its economic construct, and its social construct. So this crisis could be an opportunity to revise this, but unfortunately, the opportunity today is not seizable because people are really struggling for the day-to-day, and also the regional environment is still volatile and does not allow for calmly and coldly addressing and answering these questions.
Let's focus maybe here on one element. You mentioned the role of the political elite, and in particular how, in a sense, the civil war and the end result of the civil war is still shaping Lebanese politics. Can you maybe say a few words on that? Because for the audience in Singapore, this might be a bit far away. Can you say a few words on how the balance of power, if I can say so, or the distribution of power among the different communities, different sectarian leaders, is still, in a sense, defining the Lebanese political system, and at the same time, it might actually be the problem to solve this crisis?
Mm-hmm. There are many levels in your question and in what you rightly depict. There is the level of sectarianism that is, in fact, kind of congenital of the construction of the country, or at least of the modern Lebanese state. This is a problem, of course, but this problem cannot explain by itself alone everything. for example, saying that sectarianism alone has led to the Lebanese war is a kind of shortcut. It has, of course, been a sine qua non reason, but it was not the only reason. The second layer of what you are saying, so just to continue on this first point, sectarianism is still very potent today in Lebanon. It is even more potent than ever. It has created, of course, circuits of corruption, clientelism, nepotism that have crippled the Lebanese state. Plus, it has exacerbated the paralysis of the state and the decision-making. But this alone cannot only explain what is happening today. What is also explaining today's crisis is, and you alluded to it, is the legacy of the war that has been unaddressed by lack of, you can choose lucidity, courage, boldness, risk-taking of the political elite, but also, and we have to admit it, Jean-Loup, also the apathy of the Lebanese society. I mean, the sudden surge and awakening of the Lebanese society 2 years ago is a bit late. I mean, they could have been more aware and conscious that this political elite that is partly inherited from the past, partly inherited from the post-war era, the landlords, the warlords turned and transformed into politicians, where all this political system was leading the society to this destruction and ruin. But unfortunately, society was also bribed. I mean, it was living on largesses due to the sectarian system, nepotism and clientelism, also because of the economic choices that allowed the Lebanese to live well in a kind of mirage, in a kind of illusion, in fact, that was addictive. And also because, and we have to say it, that the Lebanese individually are maybe brilliant and successful, but collectively do not have the stomach and the appetite and the stamina for constructing real political forces. So in fact, they completely let the public sphere aside, and they completely left it to the politicians. And now they are trying to cope with all these results. So you have sectarianism, you have the result of the war, you have the result of the post-war era that we're not talking about enough, the choices that were made at that point. And you have a society that is interested in politics only in the sense that it can provide it ways of living leisurely and luxuriously, but is not in fact politically involved in the sense of having, let's say, of developing projects, alternatives, etc. And you see it today very starkly with I think the bad situation of the opposition. A lot of people are betting today on elections next spring to induce a change in the country. But when you look at the forces of change, the forces of opposition, also they have not done their homework. So challenging the system, and the system in Lebanon is very strong. The state is weak, but the system is very strong. Challenging the system with only a few slogans and you know, part-time politics and etc. will not make it. It will not be enough. So the system is here to stay, unfortunately. This will probably aggravate the collapse and the ruin, and it will probably impoverish the country for decades to come. So in a nutshell, what we can say, Jean-Loup, is that the Lebanon of yesterday is over. Even sectarianism of yesterday is over. Today, the diseases and the symptoms of the country are much graver and much deeper than that. It's a country that can simply not function anymore on the technical level, on the day-to-day level. We were talking about it. And also it is confronting for the first time in its history a very volatile regional situation whereby the usual, the classical, the traditional regional stakeholders are not even concerned or caring about what's happening in Lebanon. The way the Gulf states are turning their back to the country is very symptomatic. The way the West is turning its back on Lebanon is very symptomatic. The level of Western care for Lebanon is today at its minimum. Other players have interest, but these interests are not enough to float the country, to put it afloat again, be them Iran or the Syrian regime or Russia or etc. They are only looking for, let's say, ameliorating their position in the Levant, and Lebanon is one let's say, box in this game. So I think that for the first time, the Lebanese are left to themselves, and their problems are enormous, and they don't have the stamina, the capacity, and the bandwidth to address them. So this is why I think for the first time, the crisis is reaching the level of existential.
Thank you. And we'll come back to this point on the regional actors in a few minutes. But before that, I'd like specifically to ask you a question on the domestic actors, and in particular Hezbollah, because seen from the outside, a lot of the people usually look at Lebanon and point at Hezbollah as one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, for all the issues. As you explained, this is much more complex. But could you say maybe a few words on the public perception today in Lebanon of Hezbollah? If there's any way to measure the public opinion, especially after the explosion of the port last year. You mentioned also Hezbollah's commitment, Hezbollah intervention in Syria. How does that affect the public perception of Hezbollah now inside the country?
Here again, there are several layers. It's a very complex question. First of all, the diagnosis, I mean, the cold diagnosis. Hezbollah is today, and this is beyond any discussion, I mean, it's not even a polemical question anymore. Hezbollah is today the predominant force in Lebanon. It is, if not completely the state, but it is not only the state within a state, but it is the state above the state. Every strategic decision in Lebanon cannot be made without the acquiescence of Hezbollah. This is beyond discussion. Now, the level of, let's say, lethality of this is, of course, to be discussed, and the way to deal with this is, of course, a matter of discussion. Now, Hezbollah has been able to reach this level of predominance because of many factors. First of all, a very steady, constant, and resolute investment by Iran in this part of the Levant. Probably Hezbollah is the biggest investment of Iran outside Iran, financially, symbolically, politically, etc. And it has been, in that sense, a success story for Iran, partly explained by strategic and tactical mistakes done by its adversaries. The latest in date is this Gulf, let's say, indifference towards Lebanon that will probably increase Hezbollah's grip on the country, because the vacuum will be filled probably by Iran and by Hezbollah. The regional dynamic, this is the second or third point, the regional dynamic is also adding to that, because Iran is, we like it or not, winning in the region. I mean, it is marking points in Yemen, in Iraq, albeit all things, in Syria, definitely, in Lebanon. And there is also today a Western, more or less passive acceptance of this situation, and the negotiation about the GCPOA and other dynamics are increasing this dynamic. And this is probably giving also Hezbollah the perception that it is winning in the region, so this win has to be translated in Lebanon. Now, the perception by other parties in Lebanon of this oscillate between extreme cynicism, saying, okay, this is the new potent actor. We have normalized with Syria in the 90s. Now we have to normalize with Hezbollah and Iran again. And I think that the terms of this normalization are not exactly yet under discussion, but it will become the case. And you have another part of society that is living in a kind of, I would say, a mix of denial and anger towards that, but that prevent this part of society of really building a strategy to counter or to, let's say, coexist with this state of affairs. So this is where you have, I think, partly the explanation of this, let's say, increasing and very worrying passivity in Lebanese society that is translated in the brain drain, in the emigration of the middle class, in the fact that people are already, let's say, saying, okay, this is irreversible, we cannot change things, so let's look for something elsewhere. And again, I come back to what I was saying, the level of unpreparedness of the opposition forces is very symptomatic, because in fact, they are not confronting exactly the problem, and they are not crafting the weapons and the tools that will allow them to confront this problem. So the perception is unanimously today in Lebanon that of a country that has fallen in the hands of Iran. And I told you, the reaction to that are threefold: cynicism and adaptation, anger and denial, but that leads to nowhere, and exit, drain, and emigration, and idea that this country is no ours, quote unquote. So these are the three reactions. The problem, or I think one interesting question that could be raised, is what does Hezbollah intend to do with this victory? I mean, how does Hezbollah intend to govern, quote unquote, Lebanon once it will become completely in its hand? And this is, I think, a question that few people have an answer to, because it's difficult to have this dialogue with Hezbollah now. And second, because many people don't want to have this dialogue with Hezbollah.
I mean, this leads us to a lot of questions. I'm receiving a lot of questions from our audience. Let's unpack the regional dimension here. And you mentioned Hezbollah's strength inside the country, Iran's influence. In August, there were again exchange of rockets, exchange of fire from south of Lebanon to Israel, and for a few days it almost looked like there could be a potential new conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. The last conflict between Israel and Hezbollah happened in 2006. So it's rather old now, given the frequency of Israel's conflicts in the region. How do you see Hezbollah's strategy, if there is a strategy, vis-a-vis Israel? How do you explain this last exchange of fire? Is it just a gamble? Do you see that as miscalculation? How do you make sense of this current situation?
Yeah, first of all, no, Hezbollah definitely has a strategy towards Israel. Lebanon doesn't have, but Hezbollah has a strategy. It's probably it has not a better, but it has more of a strategy towards Israel than Israel has a strategy towards Hezbollah, because Israel is in fact a bit lost when it comes to Hezbollah. They know that the monster, quote unquote, as they depict it, is growing. They know that they will have to do something about it, but they don't know what to do about it. Hezbollah knows what to do about Israel. It is a strategy of maximal deterrence, meaning that they know that Israel knows that it can shower Israel with hundreds of thousands of rockets, 10,000 a day, that these rockets are increasingly precise and lethal. And so the cost of any adventure in Lebanon by Israel is very high. This is the strategy of Hezbollah. Having said that, I'm convinced that neither Hezbollah nor Israel want a conflict, an open, a real conflict at the border. They would accept sporadic flare-ups of violence, exchange of rockets, rounds of violence, killings, etc., drone operations, yes. But this is what Israel calls wars within war, or wars within wars. And this is what Hezbollah calls the rules of engagement. And these rules of engagement, now that you have the Syrian theater close to Lebanon, in which Hezbollah is today the most potent force in the south, is different. It's a Syrian Lebanese theater. It's much more complicated and complex. And the rules of engagement between both parties is now very well, let's say, explained and understood by both, and they abide by it. Despite the round of violence that you have described, that was a kind of, it was a session of message exchanging between both at the eve of the resumption of the nuclear talks, at the eve of many things. Hezbollah today, and this is another aspect of the question, interesting that because it brings us back to the crisis in Lebanon. On the top of the military strategic calculus of Hezbollah towards Israel, the social and economic situation of Lebanon today, and